Thank you. And we have about an hour and 15 minutes together. So we'll be opening with some short remarks from panelists, and that will be followed with a discussion based on some of the questions that you posed when you registered. And then we'll have a time for open questions at the end. When we host webinars, we use the Q&A function to monitor and track and respond to questions. So we will not be responding to the chat. So please use the Q&A to ask your questions. Once again, welcome, and I encourage you to introduce yourself and to share where you're joining us from, and we'll get started very quickly. So just as a way of a bit of a setup, there are a number of wildfires that are burning in Canada. A number of them are out of control at the moment. And it has become more important increasingly over the last couple of years to think about how we're communicating around this issue. And so really what we want to do in this webinar is to create a space for surfacing, but also discussing some of the insights that researchers are working on, including some of our own, but then also some of the issues. Panelists will offer a number of concrete advice about practical tips around messaging, visuals, misinformation, and then also what does it mean for some of the conversations that we'll need to have into the future. So I'm really looking forward to a lively discussion. I think it'll be very interesting. I think it's very relevant to the moment that we're in. I will introduce our panelists, and once again, please introduce yourselves in the chat. So our first panelist is Dr. Louise Comeau. She's a senior advisor at Re.Climate, which is Carleton's Center for Climate Change Communications and Public Engagement. She's also a member of the Federal Net Zero Advisory Body, and she has more than 30 years of experience in climate change policy, communications, and solutions-related advocacy and programming. She holds a doctorate in environmental management, focused on environmental ethics and behavior change from the University of New Brunswick. So thank you, Louise. Our next panelist is Dr. Chris Russell. He's an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Communications and academic director of Re.Climate at Carleton. His work focuses on problems of disinformation and denial and their relevance to climate action. He co-edited Critical Approaches to Climate Change and Civic Action, which is a collection exploring conceptual interventions in public forms of climate action. Our next panelist is Sergio Velasquez-Rose, and he's a senior, seasoned, and innovative leader driving the strategy and analytics behind Potential Energy. He's worked and has experience at firms like McKinsey and Saks Fifth, and he brings a deep commitment to data and a drive for impact. So Sergio is a passionate advocate as well for diversity, equity, and inclusion, championing initiatives aimed at fostering a more inclusive workplace. So thank you, Sergio. And finally, our last panelist is Dr. Robin Cox. She advances leadership in climate and disaster resilience, drawing on design thinking and open learning approaches. Robin is cultivating climate action leadership through education, research, and advocacy. She is the director of Resilience by Design Lab at Royal Roads University, and she works with interdisciplinary and multi-sectorial teams of faculty, students, and external partners, so including governments, businesses, academics, to conduct regional and national and international climate adaptation research and capacity building projects. So an amazing panel. Lots of different interesting perspectives. And without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Louise, to kick us off. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll just pause a moment while the imagery is brought up. There we are. Thank you. So we've had a pretty good introduction to the fact that we are experiencing wildfires. And we're going to introduce some ideas here that'll be reinforced by Sergio. And one of them is thinking about these in the context of being unnatural disasters and the links that they have to the causes of climate change, which is a challenge in terms of public understanding. Next slide, please. I'm going to speak very quickly because we have 8 minutes about some of the context around wildfires and the research we've been doing. Talk about imagery best practice, trusted spokespeople with respect to wildlife communications, and getting our words right. Next slide, please. So there's just no other way to think about 2023 than in the context of outsized impacts, if you will, or statistics. Both the number of fires, but the scale of the fires in terms of the hectares of land burned, and that they went from one end of the country to the other, and that we had a record number of megafires burning at the same time. Next slide, please. What that did was lead to some context that I think we're becoming more and more accustomed to, seeing scientists really use language that expresses their own dismay. And in this particular case, the scientist at Natural Resources Canada, Jan Belanger, talking about how the season last year that we experienced, how shocking it was. And you can see in the graph just how much territory was burned relative to what the the year to year averages have been. Next slide, please. The thing about wildfires is, and when we're thinking about communications, we're often thinking about our words. And I will speak to the question of words, but I want to more focus in this presentation on images. And when we think about best practice in imagery, many of you likely already do this. And if you haven't done this before, we highly recommend the work of Climate Visuals in the UK. Re.Climate is also looking to create a Canadian version of this, and they've done a fair bit of research that really establishes best practice in using imagery. And a lot of the extreme event communications and images that we see are using the wrong imagery. And so in this context, the principles, there are 7 principles. I think these can also be expanded on. Show real people, tell news stories, show climate change causes at scale. And I'm putting in square brackets that I also believe we need to show impacts and solutions at scale. Show emotionally powerful impacts, obviously understand your audience, show local but serious impacts, a particularly important one with wildfires, and being careful in particular for environmental groups in using protest imagery. Next slide, please. The reason why imagery is so important is it not only engages us at an emotional level, but it addresses something that we really see as a psychological gap in the public's understanding of climate change. And that is, despite the increase in our understanding of extreme events, whether we're experiencing them personally or through others, that we have a distance gap. We have a perception of climate change as affecting people in other places, but also affecting us in other timescales. So not immediate to me today or to my family. And this lack of risk and understanding of climate change as something affecting us today really does undermine a sustained commitment to climate action. And so we are looking at using imagery more to help us close that psychological gap. Next slide, please. In focus groups that we held recently, we exposed participants in 13 different focus groups to different kinds of wildfire imagery. And let me tell you, this is a very difficult thing to do to meet those climate visuals principles. And so we tried various versions. I'm going to show you 4. The first thing is that in getting reactions to these images, people were affected quite emotionally, even with these 2 that I would say are not really perfect in terms of their capabilities of delivering messaging. People talked about feeling stressed, anxious, a sense of tragedy was what they perceived, and they felt scared. Next slide, please. In terms of commentary, people reacted both to these images in terms of the wildfires being heroes of theirs, to being concerned about the exhaustion and the desolation as a result of the fires, and the fact that they're perceiving these fires as coming closer and closer to them. This one person saying, we just don't think of fires in the Northwest Territories. The one on the right, though, is really important. This woman who was in one of the focus groups, deeply uncomfortable about climate change itself, who was very affected by animals being affected, nature being affected. And there is a segment of the Canadian population that is concerned about climate change, feels very connected to nature, but may not be as engaged on certain policy questions like the carbon price as other people are. And so there is a way to connect if we remember that it's about people, planet, and that includes nature and animals. Next slide, please. This imagery also generated discussions about the health effects of and the smoke and the air pollution that people were exposed to. This was really a concern. People talked about not being able to go outside. And in particular, as I've mentioned, the more socially conservative in the focus groups were very, very concerned about the nature impacts. But neither of these images did the full job that needed to be done. And so we tried two versions in the next slide that I'll show you. And these were to try to bring into the story more engagement at the level of showing people and showing evacuation. Now, again, on the next slide, you'll see that, again, even though we made progress, we did better in terms of meeting the climate visuals principles, that we really didn't make it all the way through. People talked about reacting emotionally, seeing these images, but the people in the top image, image A, were really not looking like they were affected by it. They looked like they were observers. This one person called it gawking. On the right, on the bottom, image B, people talked about it's not clear. Are they parked? Are they really evacuating? And so the idea emerged in the focus groups, and this has also emerged in my own research that we'll show you in the next slide. And that is that we really need to think about, until we find a better way to show wildfire imagery in one image, if you will, done properly, that we need to work with collage. And here's an example of several images we think get us closer, showing the impacts on scale, at scale in the top left, showing evacuation at scale in the bottom left, showing the wildfire fighters trying to grab a bite, and showing this, I think, quite evocative image of a burned out school bus. Next slide, please. There's also a sensitivity that we want to alert folks to in terms of communicating wildfires before, during, and after. The key thing before the events is to explain the climate aspects. This is when we can talk about and forewarn what the summer might be like, what events we might experience, clarify the causes, start talking about fossil fuels being part of the moment. During the events, it is a teachable moment, but not for everybody. If you're directly affected, this is not the moment that you're focused on looking at information about wildfires. But all of the people, and in fact, recent research shows about 40% of the population feel they've experienced to some degree these events, but it's indirect. It's because they know somebody that's been affected. Those folks are information seeking. It's a wonderful time and an important time to be trying to bring the link to fossil fuels into the story. And then after the event, it's the right time to talk about making sense of the events, emphasizing climate change causes and solutions, stepping up our advocacy efforts, talking about the need for preparedness like fire smart programs, having a go bag and things like that. Next slide, please. So let me just close, and again, a little tip to Sergio in terms of our message triangle. We do have a challenge that climate change is harming us directly, but it's not perceived that way day to day for most people. And we want to highlight that. We want to communicate that climate change is harming us directly or through the people we know, harming our health, burning our homes and communities in places that we love. That emotional attachment to the places we care about, whether it's our parks, our communities, our homes, is really important. We have a choice. And until we deal with the causes of climate change, wildfires will keep getting worse until we stop burning fossil fuels. And our opportunity is to pull together to join other Canadians that are also worried about climate change, who want their governments to hold big polluters accountable. And I will close it there. I think the next slide gives you a hint at a tip sheet that we've prepared with some of these communication insights from our research that is available, and we'll be posting the link in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. So over to you, Chris.
Great. Thank you. That was amazing. I have so many thoughts running through my head. Okay, can we go down a couple slides, please? I'm going to just jump right in. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Yeah, perfect. So, we know, I think many of us here, that events associated with climate impacts, especially those we experience as an emergency or crisis, they draw attention and engagement, and they're associated with surges in climate concern. So last year, despite rampant misinformation on digital platforms and hesitance really in mainstream media to connect wildfires to climate change for much of the cycle, we saw almost 70% of people make this connection and express concern with climate change in the context of wildfire. So there's a lot of questions there in terms of how sticky or enduring that concern is and whether it's retained through memory of those events. But people are drawn into and become concerned around climate change in the context of wildfire. So we're not the only ones that know this, of course. These events have opened up as a front in climate politics, by which I mean denialists, grievance grifters, conspiracists all show up during these events with content that are intended to disrupt or displace the congealing of concern with climate change. And we saw this last year with the wildfires in Canada. Justin Ling emphasized or estimated upwards of millions of people were engaging with this content, with false, misleading, conspiratorial content. And other journalists were noticing this as well and trying to offer explanations to the readers. So we wanted to help with that a little bit, and we decided to dig in. I think the next slide would be probably useful at this point. So what we did was we made a network map. We wanted to map the online conversation, which we're still in the process of doing, to assess for the role and significance of false and misleading information therein. So for the wildfire report, which I think we've shared with you or will share with you shortly, we drew this map of the Twitter conversation to get us started and segmented into 7 distinct online groups in the conversation from earlier this year, and then went back to look at what happened in the previous year. It's composed of Twitter accounts, all likely located in Canada, which is not an easy thing to do, that discuss climate topics. So I can't talk much about this, even though people are usually quite curious about this. So I'll just suggest that you can find many of your questions answered in the report that we wrote, and skip ahead. So instead, what I want to focus on is the narratives and engagement pattern we found in that conversation. And I'm going to use 3 key spikes in online engagement over the course of last year's season to structure the remarks. So the first spike you can see there, it's early May. It became clear that the fires were cropping up earlier and more intensely than usual. It was the Alberta group of accounts that were really driving the conversation at the outset in what I take to be a typical way. They were discussing the preparedness and response of the Alberta government, the UCL party, Daniel Smith, for the fires, often critically by referencing budget cuts to question whether that had degraded the preparedness and ability to respond. Although you can already see a kind of blue-purple line spiking up. At this time, May 6th is where you see most of the content spiking, and that's when there was a declaration of emergency. Most of the spikes occur around a declaration of emergency or something similar to that. But you can see that little spike among right anti-establishment accounts beginning to push an arson narrative early in the season, sometimes sharing news that arsonists had been caught, which was false, or decontextualized via news from previous years. Occasionally, you'd find people contesting the belief that the fires were associated with climate change, which we found interesting because that was the main source of that association. Other accounts weren't really making the connection in a very overt or sustained way. So there's a lot of protesting against it, driving the connection, interestingly enough. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, this is when there's the largest spike. We see right anti-establishment accounts beginning to drive engagement with arson narratives once the fires reached New York City, and this draws international attention. So some of this is just, you may remember, bewildering. We've got drones, space lasers, weather control offered as explanations for what's happening. But in this month, it wasn't just low follower accounts that were pushing the narrative, as seemed to be the case back in May, but more influential accounts in the right anti-establishment community, including some politicians, and the continued use of decontextualized news articles from mainstream media, often from previous years, shared again suggesting that arsonists had been identified or caught. As well, during this month, the narratives developed a more conspiratorial and extreme variant, including claims of eco-terrorism, claims that the Canadian government was setting fires to generate a sense of crisis in order to depopulate rural regions or just to build support for climate policies. Next slide, please. In August, we see our kind of third largest, we see another spike here with the evacuation of Yellowknife and the state of emergency declared in BC. Trudeau sent military assistance to BC. And at this point, we begin to register and notice material disruptions that are worth further investigation and I think are quite concerning. So this isn't just hand-wringing around the state of public discourse from people like me, but things begin happening in the world in ways that would follow logically from a belief in these darker narratives. So we began to see reports of confusion due to misinformation among those evacuating and among those helping to try to manage and coordinate the emergency response. Some of you out west might remember the brief formation of a Truth and Freedom convoy that formed to confront police on an evacuation route out of apparent concern with state control of mobility and displacement of people to defend their community, which registered with the idea that this was an effort to depopulate rural regions. BC Wildfire pulled its firefighters in that region in response, at least temporarily. And so it was, I would say, a concerning time. And then the Maui fires, which were devastating and very impactful, killed many people, seemed to be interpreted through this conspiratorial lens as well, linking smart city and 15-minute city conspiracies for those of you that are familiar with that. Next slide, please. So to briefly summarize, I'll do this very quickly. There's really two arson narratives that were in circulation. One was simply used to deflect or displace concern with climate change by giving people an alternative explanation to hold. These two quotes here are from Daniel Smith, who I think crystallized this well in terms of just making reference to lots of stories out there, ongoing investigations. Again, articles circulated about past arrests that were decontextualized, just giving people a story they could hold on to if they don't want to accept official explanations. And then I'll close on the next slide, which is arson narrative 2. This was the darker variant we saw come up later in the season, but that I think will continue to structure some of this content going forward, which claims eco-terrorists, leftists, or the Canadian government are starting these crises to fabricate support for climate policies that would otherwise be opposed by people. These often blur together references to a fake pandemic emergency, to a fake climate emergency. And so you can see how climate is being pulled into an adversarial narrative that was very familiar among anti-public health influencers and right and anti-establishment networks, a development that I think we're going to have to pay closer attention to. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand it off to Sergio.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you all. I'm head of strategy and analytics for Potential Energy, as Amber introduced. I wanted to first share just a quick personal story and then dive into the data and what we've learned. I have my own personal experience with wildfires. I was actually living in Cape Town, South Africa in 2017, which was an extended period of drought for South Africa. And I was woken up in the middle of the night because a blazing wildfire on Table Mountain was closing in on our home. And it was disorienting, terrifying, incredible amount of smoke. Actually, our safety alarm system had gone off because the smoke was so thick that it had triggered the alarms to go off. And it's clear that fossil fuel pollution and climate change was a major factor in having such an extended period of drought, which was unusual for the area, and for these wildfires to increase in both frequency and intensity. So this is a very personal topic to me, and I hope that what we're going to share with you today is helpful in helping communicate around this topic, and in particular draw that connection to fossil fuel pollution and climate change. First of all, a super quick note on our data. We are a non-partisan charitable organization based in the United States, but we do work globally. So what we're going to share today is intended for educational purposes only. We have a significant body of research, which I'm going to skip over very quickly just because of time. But I do want to make two shout outs. One, the Yale program on climate change communications, who was our partner in producing what you will see today. And then also Climate Central, who we've been working together with and getting advisory from. You'll see me use this term lift quite a bit throughout the presentation today and in any work that you see from Potential Energy. Lift just means how much higher or lower is the support for a particular policy or a particular attitude or belief. And so that delta between sort of what a survey standard would tell you versus what a exposure to a message generates is what we're referring to. If you have any questions on that, happy to answer that during the Q&A. All right, so the first thing that is really important for everyone in this webinar to think about is we cannot miss the opportunity to motivate action during extreme weather events. Dr. Louise talked about this a bit previously, but there are key moments right before, during the event, and after the event where there is an increase in information seeking from the public, and that is not just the public who's being directly affected, but also the public at large who is observing this, and there's a spike in the news cycle, and so more people are engaged with the topic, and that presents an opportunity for teachable moments and for continued education on the role that fossil fuel pollution plays in exacerbating extreme weather events. This is based on US data. So 73% of Americans say that the world is experiencing more extreme weather patterns, but they're getting quite acclimated. The number of people who are worried about climate change affecting their community is in the low teens. And we see headlines about the new normal, the new normal, the new normal everywhere. Let me be super, super explicit and clear. We cannot allow this concept of the new normal to take hold. This is not normal, and we need to fight against this narrative that is making people believe that this is in fact normal. One of our biggest enemies is this idea that extreme weather events are just natural. What we find is that 50% of respondents in our survey, again, this is a US sample, believe that extreme weather is driven by natural changes, and we know that we have a mountain of scientific evidence that tells us that this is not true. And so we need to be able to shift the conversation from that natural to the unnatural. We put together this narrative platform after significant research, both qualitative and quantitative. And this is what we propose you all please use when communicating around wildfires and other types of extreme weather events. The headline is "Unnatural disasters are destroying what we love." And there are 4 components that follow. So there's 3 pillars. One is that unnatural disasters are the result of fossil fuel pollution. Making that foundational connection is really, really important, given what we just learned about how half of Americans believe that changes in the weather are natural. 2, that they're hurting us right here, right now. Dr. Louise, again, talked quite a bit about this, but making the impacts personal and human and present. And then 3, impacting the people and places we love. We found in our research over 23 countries that love is the primary motivator for action on climate change. And so we want to lean into that message. And then lastly, our call to action is to join the millions demanding smart climate policy. So again, bringing it back to climate change and fossil fuel pollution. One thing that we're really excited about is if you see the results on the right-hand side, climate support increased by 10 percentage points overall. That's 8 percentage points amongst Democrats, 12 percentage points amongst Republicans. This is a platform that really works across the political spectrum, and it is not going to cause further polarization. As I mentioned, there are four major pillars that underpin this narrative, and I'll go quickly through each of them. First, fossil fuel pollution is the cause. So we tested language to drive the connection between worsening extreme weather and fossil fuel pollution. You will see on the left-hand side the narrative that we tested around just naming extreme weather and calling out the worsening issues with extreme weather. On the right-hand side, we introduced the concept of unnatural disasters. We tested a number of other phrases alongside this to try to get a sense of what worked best, and unnatural disasters was the winning platform. What's really exciting is when you think about that 50% stat that I talked about earlier, by using the phrase unnatural disasters in that narrative, we're able to drive comprehension and understanding of the fossil fuel pollution connection by an additional 9 percentage points overall. And again, you see that it works across the political spectrum, including amongst independents, Republicans, and Democrats, versus just using the words extreme weather. which only had a 4 percentage point lift and was actually not statistically significant amongst independents. Two, it is hurting us right here and right now. It is really important to draw the connection to today. And like Dr. Louise said, again, not make the impacts seem distant, because they're not distant. They are, in fact, right here. They have been right here. One of, I guess, the good news is that wildfires, like other types of heat events, have a higher connection to climate change in people's minds. However, as you see here, only 39% of people believe that global warming is impacting wildfires a lot. So there's a significant gap still to be filled. And only 39% of respondents are very worried about wildfires harming them and their local community. Continuing on this message of how it's hurting us right here, right now, what we find is that using very clear factual statistics, such as 2023 was the hottest year on record, is really helpful in helping people make that connection and understand how it is, in fact, an issue today, and it's not something that's just a natural weather pattern. Third, it is about the people. Real stories about real people. I'm not going to read the two messages here. I encourage you to go and look at our report. But on the left-hand side, we have a financial cost narrative. On the right-hand side, we have a first-person human impact story. And the delta in lift and support is quite significant. Lastly, joining together to demand for policy change. One of the biggest issues that we see in all of the conversation around extreme weather, and I think we see that with wildfires and what's been shared so far, is the idea that we have some personal accountability and individual actions that we can take, such as recycling and composting and things like that. But very few people are understanding the systemic solutions that are needed in order to address climate change. And because they're not drawing the connection between fossil fuel pollution and worsening extreme weather, they're also not thinking about it as a part of the solution set. Less than half selected transitioning from fossil fuels or setting limits to air and carbon pollution as potential solutions to worsening extreme weather, while a full 12% selected no solutions at all, which is really, really concerning. So our CTA that we recommend using is Join the Millions Demanding Smart Climate Policies, which we believe makes systemic solutions appealing and effective. What we found in discussions with focus groups is many people feel like they're the only person that cares about climate or that cares about addressing worsening extreme weather. And this idea of joining the millions seems to help clarify for them that they are not, in fact, alone, that they are part of a collective and that there is power in that collective. With that, I encourage all of us to take this summer season, which we know is projected to be amongst the worst in extreme weather events, obviously wildfires, but also hurricane season projected to be quite devastating, to really take that opportunity to mobilize the millions in the moment. We've developed a resource hub alongside some of our partners, as I mentioned earlier, where you can find our resource guide with more details on our guidance, as well as content that is ready to use. You can take it, put your logo on it, spread this information on social media, on YouTube, whatever channels you have available to you. And then, of course, use the words unnatural disasters when communicating on extreme weather this summer, or the hashtag unnatural disasters, which we would love to see trending so that we can shift the narrative in the public. With that, I will stop here. And if you scan this QR code, you can get to our resource hub. Shameless plug.
Thanks, Sergio. We can lose the slides now, even your QR code. Thanks for Re.Climate for including me in this important conversation, and for all of you for joining us. And thanks to all the panelists for provocative presentations. There are many questions and thoughts I have as well. So as I was preparing for this webinar, I really was thinking, what is it that I can offer that my colleagues whose work and research actually focuses on climate communication wouldn't already be saying about this topic? As my bio suggests and made clear, my research doesn't focus on climate communication per se. I'm a psychologist by training, and I worked for years providing psychosocial support and psychological first aid in the context of unnatural disasters, including wildfires. So I can certainly offer some practical information about how to prepare for wildfires and evacuations and what it means to offer that kind of support. What it means to be in the context of wildfires, because I have not directly experienced them, but I have responded to wildfires such as the McClure and Kelowna Park fires and the Fort McMurray wildfire and many other unnatural disasters. So I'm more than happy to offer that in the Q&A. But what I wanted to focus on in this short talk, and what I think we need to be communicating about wildfires and climate change, really flows from what you were saying, Sergio, which is that wildfires signify to us, as we move forward in the context of escalating climate impacts and uncertainty, an understanding of the underlying causes and what we can do about those causes. Wildfires serve as a visible, intense, and now widely experienced signifier of the escalating crisis of global heating. And as we've already heard, climate change is not the only contributing factor, but it is creating the enabling conditions for this escalating crisis of wildfires. And the escalation of wildfire risks and wildland-urban interface fires in particular, those WUI fires that impact communities, including the impacts of wildfire-generated smoke, these are affecting huge numbers of people directly and indirectly. And this means that wildfires can act as focusing events that focus attention on the underlying causes of both wildfires and climate change. And in so doing, have the potential, I would say often unrealized, to inspire the necessary conversations and actions to imagine and create changes that can lead to a more climate and wildfire resilient future. So to say that wildfires create these opportunities, not to minimize the suffering and trauma of wildfires, nor the huge social, psychological, material, and economic loss and disruption they're causing. Stats like the $3.1 billion price tag for last season's wildfires. But those stats don't address, one, the uninsured damages, things like the mental and other health costs, the impact on livelihoods and ecosystems, the structural and social cultural losses that are not accounted for. But they also don't tell the stories of how it came to be that we're in this situation. And so there's an opportunity with wildfire communication to explore wildfires not only as a practical problem, which it is, but as a symptom of a larger problem. And yes, first as a symptom of climate change, but also, and that connection does need to be made, and it's often not being made, but also as a symptom of the fundamentally deeper problem, which is that our cultural beliefs and values, those things that have resulted in the rules and systems and policies and practices that shape our society, are not serving us well. Wildfire communication during wildfire season can, and I would argue should, make these connections visible. They should make visible the patterns of material and ideological choices that have created this crisis. And as Sergio said, expose this as not normal, new or otherwise. This includes highlighting the legacy of policy failures, things such as decades of fire suppression and other forest management practices that have deferred wildfire risk to today in service of corporate profits and the economic benefit of the few. It also includes highlighting the development practices that we are continuing to use that are pushing residential and industrial construction further and further into wilderness and wilderness adjacent areas, thereby increasing the threat and destructive potential of WUI fires. But at the same time, wildfire communication can expose the assumption that perpetual economic growth is sustainable, and that this endless cycle of consumption and waste is the only economic option we have, and that it is disconnected from the crisis we're in. Wildfire communication can expose the pre-existing patterns of inequality that underlie and drive disaster vulnerability, and it can denormalize these inequities. Wildfire communication, I would argue, can inspire conversations that challenge the belief that humans are somehow separate from nature and that nature, therefore, is a resource to be exploited for profit rather than part of who we are and how we exist. Wildfire communication can debunk the myth that we are able to technology our way out of climate change. And wildfire communication can continue to challenge the marginalization and oppression of Indigenous peoples and the knowledges and cultural practices they offer that are essential to protecting the forests and waters and species of which we are a part. Over a decade ago, Neil Everden, in his book, recommend it, The Natural Alien, spoke to the deeper problem, the problem that we are both the victims of and the perpetrators of this crisis. Now, quote, "The environmental crisis is not simply something we can examine and resolve. We are the environmental crisis. The crisis is a visible manifestation of our very being, like territory revealing the self at its center," end quote. So we need to weave this understanding in wildfire communication, and in so doing, inspire conversations about how and who the status quo is serving. We have to move beyond individualism, this idea that our individual actions are sufficient to changing the trajectory we are on. And we need to move beyond this idea that if we can only come up with the right solution, we will solve this crisis and we will solve wildfires. So what does this look like in practice? We know from social and behavioral psychology that to motivate change requires first understanding the root causes of the issues and problems, inspiring the need for systemic change. We need to have a vision for a realistic and more desirable outcome. And then we need to feel a sense of agency in order to act on those issues and create those more desired outcomes. And we know that people develop a sense of agency through learning from the actions of others, social learning. That is critical. In the case of wildfire communication, this means we need to be communicating stories that unveil and unpack the underlying causes and providing concrete examples of people doing things differently, people that are not only coping and adapting to wildfires, but learning for and transforming in the face of those challenges. This includes concrete place-based examples of people in community making changes such as cultural and prescribed burning, employing fire smart practices and wildfire resilient land use practices, or examples such as the one offered on CBC Vancouver this morning when I woke up, of citizens in the small remote community of Kingfisher being empowered to learn about how to fight fires and then building mobile water stations at the foot of their driveways in order to be able to do that. This kind of wildfire communication also needs to highlight the underlying conditions for resilience. The reality that wildfire resilient communities are communities that are resilient in the everyday. They're communities that cultivate strong social and cultural bonds, that have the capacity to identify and prioritize problems and then collectively act to address those problems. Communities that use local, community-driven and equity-centered approaches, and that prioritize developing and nurturing volunteerism and functional networks that support local and regional collaboration. Communities that take measures to build awareness of where vulnerabilities may exist and then take actions to reduce those vulnerabilities. Those are resilient communities, and those are wildfire resilient communities. By seeing the potential of wildfires as a signifier of the larger story, a signal of the patterns of historic and ongoing choices we are collectively making and are collectively responsible for, wildfire communication can be used to motivate collective practical actions and changes, and a collective shift to engage more deeply and courageously with where we are at, how we arrived here, and what choices we need to make to address the causes and not just the symptoms of the wildfire crisis. Climate change is here. The locked-in impacts mean that wildfires are going to increasingly impact communities and society. And even if we reduce those risks, we can't change that reality in the short term. But wildfire communication can be one part of creating a map of possibilities and helping to define a set of goals and actions that move us towards a future we want to live in. And I think that's the critical potential of wildfire communication in this season and moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. Okay, I think we'll bring all the panelists up, and the next few minutes, we will have a broader panel discussion. We've summarized a number of the questions that came through in advance when people registered. And then already we can see a lot of activity in the Q&A, and people are sharing specific questions for panelists. And so we'll turn to those just after a bit of a conversation. Do we have Louise? Can Louise come on camera? There she is. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So this first question, that was a lot of information. It was really, really excellent. You can see in the chat that people are really appreciative of the comments that you've made. Just as a way to kind of bring this home, I'd like to open it up, and I encourage the panelists to think about not only their own, but maybe you were inspired by some of the comments of your fellow panelists. What are one or two things that communicators can do in this moment to really draw the connection between climate change and wildfires? We know that that's really important, or to communicate more effectively. So I'm going to start off with Louise as our first panelist, but the question is a couple of minutes, just your thoughts around how do we increase this connection between climate change driving wildfires and how to communicate more effectively.
Yes, I mean, I do think, and there were a number of comments about the concerns around imagery and the link to devastation and how that makes us feel emotionally. So I don't want to ignore that. I do want to say that the link to fossil fuels is one that has to be made. I mean, that's been really, really clear. Whether you're calling it carbon pollution or fossil fuel pollution, I'm going to test the differences, because in Canada we tend to say carbon pollution relative to what worked in the US. And I do think that there was another question around fossil fuels, but what about the solutions? And I think there's that timing question, the before, during, and after. So we do want to make the link that the conditions are hotter and drier, creating the tinder like conditions that start the fires, whether or make fires more likely, that make them more intense, that make them greater in extent. So we want to make that link to climate change, creating those conditions, but we also want to make that link to climate change being caused by the burning of fossil fuels. And don't just say fossil fuels. There has to be some agency. It's the burning. It's not just fossil fuels. It's the fact we're burning this stuff. And so we can do that in our communications, whether that's in your first or second sentences. And you'll see in the message triangle where we try to do that. I'd also say that the one question that we received was around how do we talk about the solutions? And I think that's the post event. When we're trying to make sense of the wildfire, we can talk about the replacement of fossil fuels with a new energy system, a more modern energy system, more reliant on efficiency and renewable energy and so on. But during the event, I think we've got to make the connection to the hot, dry conditions, the cause of it being burning, before we get into talking about the renewable energy piece of it.
Thanks, Louise. Sergio, Louise introduced a number of topics and points that you had made. I'm curious what you would zone in on or choose as the one or two things that people really do need to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think Louise did a great job. I think the two things that I would add, one, 100% making the connection to fossil fuels, right? So that is what's going to help people understand that this is not a natural phenomenon. It is actually being caused by fossil fuel pollution. A couple different phrases that we've tested that seem to work. So calling out how burning fossil fuels is causing heat trapping pollution that is overheating our planet. So the word overheating and heat trapping both being really helpful, more useful than greenhouse and some of the other phrases which have a more scientific tone to them and people have kind of tuned out at this point. And then the second piece is certainly, as Louise said, in the post-event season, when you're talking about joining the millions to call for smart climate policies, that is an opportunity to then make the connection to what those solutions are. One thing in particular that you'll see when you read the full text of our narrative is we actually call out that the solutions already exist. And I think that's also really important. I think there's kind of two parts of the gateway in order to help people get kind of to the end point. The first gateway is understanding the role of fossil fuel. The second gateway is understanding that these solutions are available, they are cost effective. And what we need to do as humans and as society and as governments is to make the right choices in order to implement them.
Thanks, Sergio. Robin, you had mentioned at the end of your remarks around the need for collective, for community-based, for resilience-based. I'm curious in terms of what really surfaces to you is like the most important thing for communicators to keep in mind around this potentially this solution conversation in specifically as somebody who actually works in emergency and who actually works in the disasters themselves.
Well, I mostly agree with what folks have already said. I think that, I mean, people in the context of an emergency are looking for practical, clear information. That's just a reality. They don't, much of what I was talking about, as I said at the start, was not geared for during the response and during the event. So people need practical information on how to respond, how to prepare, etc. But I come back to this question of how we use these wildfire seasons, which are getting longer and longer, as focusing events, and really think about this wildfire communication and this kind of communication. There was a question in the chat: can this apply to other things like heat domes and atmospheric rivers? And I think it can. The messaging obviously needs to be tailored to those specific disasters and contexts, but to use this again to look at these deeper transformative solutions. I think one of the dangers with offering solutions, and I think we need to, it's a both and, is that we are in a bit of a solutionist culture that thinks we can solve this by quick fixes, by, Fire Smart's a great program. So people need to understand that they can take steps, practical steps, to protect their homes and their communities and each other. Councils and governments need to understand, and people need to understand and pressure them to understand that they can take steps around land use management, around forest management, around development, etc., to protect them. And ultimately, I will argue none of that is going to shift it enough unless we are willing to take a hard look and a hard conversation around these deeper underlying drivers of climate change. And yes, it's fossil fuel use, but what is also driving that is, consumption culture, all these other things. So I think it's this blend of practical and riskier and more transformative messages and conversations that we need to have. And the timing of that obviously is critically important. We don't want to talk to people about that when they're having to evacuate, but we also don't want to lose sight of it just because the evacuations are over or we're in snow season. So I think this is an ongoing conversation that is a shift in how we think about communicating about climate change, the disasters and unnatural disasters it's amplifying, and what we need to be doing as citizens of the world to change that.
Thank you. Before we open it up to questions, Chris, I'm curious if you could pick one or two things that, based on the work that you've done, that communicators really do need to keep in mind when thinking about communications and climate and wildfires.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to everyone for this conversation. This has been great. One thing that's brought home to me, I think because of my personal circumstances, is I'm in a school of journalism and communication and think about what journalists need to know. And I also have kids around me all the time, and kids always want to know what's happening. And so part of what I think we need is a better story for our kids, frankly, as we think about this in a broader perspective. And I was reminded by that when Louise talked about the animals, because journalists want to know what happened and what to say, and kids want to know what about the animals every time. And so I think there's something there that we should take care of our kids in these moments, but adults talk to their kids. And there's a kind of moment there that I think is kind of interesting. Along those lines, I think one of the things that's come to mind as I've listened to this is there's the event itself, that happens, and then there's the cultural memory and how it gets embedded in our longer term cultural memory. How our personal stories, like the ones we heard from Sergio and Robin, become collective stories and become common stories and become shared stories. And so thinking about the ways and processes in which that happens, I think would be really interesting. Wildfires, at least in Canada, are not extreme events. They're seasons. And so the idea that there's a sort of seasonal aspect that could be incorporated into coverage of this by journalists. So, when Parliament goes away, you don't all go on vacation. There's another season. And so we can do hockey season coverage. We can do seasons of our favorite TV shows. I think there's something very interesting here where we can aim much higher in terms of seasonal narratives and stories with journalists that can really start to embed this in cultural memory, which is not to say we don't do all the other things we've talked about. It's about just kind of how that can embed into a larger memory instead of cultural relationships. So that's something that I'm over here working on with Australian colleagues who know a lot about wildfires as well. There is a risk there in terms of what Sergio was talking about, that seasons are often seen as cyclical or as presenting a set of norms. But I think it's an idea worth exploring.
Thank you. Yeah, Sergio, hot
I had
pursuit.
just a couple of things to what Chris said, because I completely agree, and that sparked another thought, which is um, there's a couple opportunities, right, when it comes to extreme weather events. One is sort of the before, during, and after an event is taking place, which is a relatively short window. In the during period, for the people who are not being directly impacted, but who are watching the news and seeing from afar, that is an opportunity for education, and making the connection to fossil fuels and so on. There's another opportunity that comes much later, right? Which is the anniversary of some of the biggest events which have taken place. And so in the US, there's a handful of events that are really memorable for people. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, are the types of events that we know when the anniversary is coming. For us in the US, next year will be the 20th anniversary of Katrina. I was actually also living in Louisiana when Katrina happened. I'm realizing in this time that I've actually been in a lot of extreme weather events. But that's a great opportunity, right? In the 20th anniversary, there's going to be so much coverage about what happened then. I'm not as familiar with what's in the culture as far as wildfires in Canada that have been really memorable and that people have top of mind, but I am certain they exist. And the media has a great role to play when we're talking about the anniversary of those events, to really make those connections clear, and talk about how much worse it's gotten since, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left for questions. We did receive a couple of questions, or actually many questions, in advance of the webinar. We're also receiving quite a few in the moment. There's one here that I think is particularly important for a number of people. One, and this is from Hannah. And this is for all panelists. Thank you so much for the panel. It's been extremely informative. I absolutely agree that disasters are an opportunity to inspire climate action, but the literature is extremely clear that apocalyptic climate change narratives and imagery only invite apathy rather than engaged climate action. Can you expand on how best to communicate solutions and alternative futures in the wake of disasters, as well as the value you see in collages of apocalyptic images? So you've kind of talked a little bit about this, each of you, in the responses that you've given, but really, if you could think about how do we avoid the trap of apathy and of hopelessness, while also inspiring action. So Sergio, just because you're nodding your head, I'm going to go to you first.
Yes, I think we need to draw a distinction between what is apocalyptic imagery and what is human impact in your community. And I think those are two very different things. One is in the realm of the world is coming to an end, there's nothing we can do. The imagery is very sort of like post-apocalyptic Mars, that kind of stuff. And our research also points to the fact that that does not work. Being overly alarmist does not work. What does work is making the connection to my farm, my community, people like me are being impacted in these particular ways. And that actually is very motivating and very supportive. And so I would just kind of ask that we separate the two types of imagery, because I actually don't think that they're the same. And I think our data tells us that they're not the same in the way people receive them. And then to your second point, again, I'll sort of just reiterate this concept of the solutions exist. And so we can make that statement clear, and address it. It does not have to be the end of the world. I mentioned this in the chat to a different question, but Hannah Ritchie's book, which is titled Not the End of the World, is a great discussion on exactly how we can be the first generation to have a sustainable future. And that is encouraging and exciting, and something we can point to. Louise, I'm going to call on you, even though I'm not the moderator. You're nodding.
Yeah, I will just jump in to say that in that post-event or during the event moment, you're almost, in a transitioning perspective, if you will. I really do think that we shouldn't underplay, although in the imagery that I tested in the focus groups we did, it was on the actual events itself. What I would also say, and that we will be testing in the future, is imagery that, as Sergio says, is place-based. All of the images that we showed you were of events in either Quebec, BC, and so on in Northwest Territories. So they're place-based images. The cut line captions would clearly identify that, but that we also have imagery that demonstrates people engaging in healing, repair, or resilience, or that features local people that we care about. And so those kinds of images, I think, are really part of this storytelling. But the images that we showed were also trying to identify who were you trusting to be spokespeople in these moments. And what we learned was that, people often say, oh, we trust scientists. But what we learned was they were thinking about very particular kinds of scientists, people who were on the ground, who did research, for example, in wildfire ecology, who were forest ecologists, and wildfire fighters. Which is why I was using imagery to try to get a sense of how people reacted to imagery of firefighters. On the question of imagery of people being evacuated, it is trying to get at this challenge that we have around the distance gap, that people are really spectators primarily to these events. A very small number of Canadians, as emotionally charged as it is, are being affected. And so what we're trying to do, as Sergio is saying, is to show imagery that identifies these conditions, these realities, as something that actually could affect me. And that is something that we did see in the focus groups, that people started to talk about in the reactions to these images, that they never before perceived these events could also affect them. And they feel that now because they know somebody that's being affected. And so that distance gap is one that we're trying to close. And so each of these images that we choose and the timing of those images has a purpose to play.
Thanks, Louise. Robin, I'm aware that not only, while some of the panelists think a lot about the storytelling part of it, you actually support and think a lot about the community and the community conversation part of this. So I'm just wondering, for those people who are on the webinar who work in local government perhaps, or who work more on the ground, this question around how do we not activate apathy and a sense of hopelessness. Is there anything from your research and the work that you're doing around more local or community or conversation that you think is important for us to keep in mind?
Yeah, I mean, as I said in my probably sort of rushed talk, apathy and inaction comes when people feel helpless to do something. So we need to provide examples of what people can do that will make a difference. And we need to have those conversations in communities in ways that include the diversity of our communities in those conversations, so that we don't arrive at solutions or ideas that serve one portion of the community at the expense of the other. But again, I think these conversations, having been in communities following wildfires and other disasters, there's an immediate need and desire to get back to whatever was before. And that's completely understandable. And I always have said that I would be amongst those wanting that, that's just a natural response. At the same time, there is a window, there's an opening in that community to talk about what we are moving forward to. And that's again, coming back to this, there's some other comments about, some of the things like fire smart and cooling centers as adaptive and important, and they are, but they are not. This is where I sort of, they're solutions to a component of the problem, but they are not solutions to where we are going. They may slow down wildfire risk. They may slow down climate change to some degree or help us adapt to it, but they are not going to slow it down enough or change the reality of it. So I think in those windows that disasters open up, we can have those more challenging conversations, not immediately, not while people are trying to figure out how to get a hold of their insurance companies or whether they're going to rebuild. But as that community moves forward, we can facilitate those conversations about, okay, what do we want this? What is important? What do we love? As I think it was Sergio was talked about, people respond to, and want to take action on things that they care about, what they love and what they value. So we need to have those conversations about how climate change, how wildfires are threatening that, and what we can do in order to protect those things that we love. And those are some of, as I said, very practical actions, but they are also those more transformative, challenging actions that we need to take. Composting, recycling, turning your heat down, having a tin roof are important, but they're not sufficient. They are necessary, but not sufficient actions. And if we keep having only the conversations about these very practical things, important conversations that they are, without the other conversations about these deeper underlying drivers of climate change, cultural drivers of climate change, then we are whatever, we may or may not be going towards that apocalyptic future, but we're going to a future that none of us wants to live in, I am sure. And so I think it's the both and at the community level, those conversations can be very grounded in the local culture, in the local practicalities and context, and the local values and beliefs, etc., that support that community being resilient and growing into what they want to be, and then extending that into regional conversations. So I think that's the both and of those two things.
Thank you. This is slightly not exactly on topic, Chris, but I think it is important. There was a question that came through earlier, and I do want to ask you. So in your report, conspiracy there, there was this conspiracy theory that, these are being set by arsonists, that aliens, lasers, I kind of, went to the extreme. But I guess there's this question for people and for myself is in your opinion or for your advice, what's the value of simply not giving conspiracy theories attention? Should we be pre-bunking them or inoculating against them or addressing them explicitly? Or do we just not do that at all? And what might be a couple of the trade-offs of both? What's your advice?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think most of the time, especially with the space lasers, you can just leave those alone. Just reach and attention to survive. They're just constantly proliferate. There's not too much to get upset about often with those, I would say. For more serious circumstances, I think there's a set of things we can do, which usually involve having reports that give you situational awareness, have an impact assessment, and then a set of solutions that match that. Don't overreact, I would say, in many circumstances. But the one thing we wanted to point to with the report is that there's a lot of wild claims and conspiracies out there, but the more Canadian-centric ones and the more damning ones were all variations on a theme, and that's to generate distrust and delegitimate largely government institutions, media institutions as well. So it's a story about government failing people, that it's being controlled by elites, that it's turned against common people. Those elites are indifferent to or out of touch with what people are going through in their lives and don't care about them. And that climate policy is becoming a pretext to all of that sort of control and generative of distrust about government. So I think that needs whatever kind of bunking, pre-bunking, debunking, all bunking, we need to think about government having a positive role in our lives around climate policy, because I think without some role and some honest discussion around that confronts that story, I don't see a path forward. Certainly not in the context of the sort of wildfires we're going to experience here in Canada. You can't really have a fair energy transition without government playing a positive role in people's lives. So that, I think, is the kind of takeaway we were trying to get at, that there's a story about the role of government in our lives that we have to reckon with.
Totally agree.
Yeah, thank you. Sergio, there was a question here, and I'm going to do a bad, here we go. It's from Katie Harper. And this kind of builds on what Chris was saying, but in the call to action to join millions of people calling for climate policy, Katie's question is, do people need to know what that means, particularly if they're not making the link between forest fires and climate change? How specific do you need to get in terms of the smart climate policy piece? And how do you have to provide examples for that?
I think that depends on the forum. So if you're having individual conversations in a canvassing effort or in a small group setting, I think it is very appropriate to get into what exactly are those climate solutions? What exactly should you expect your government to do in order to incentivize those solutions to take hold, to remove subsidies from fossil fuels and so on and so forth. I think when we're talking about in the larger scope of the conversation, I think because the gap on the first instance is so big, right? So drawing the connection to fossil fuel pollution is such a big gap today. That feels like the most important piece to make sure if someone is leaving a communication that they have that as the key takeaway, which will eventually lead them to phasing out of fossil fuels is the climate solution that we need to get to. But I think they won't get there without that first step. And so that would be my recommendation. But yeah, I think it depends a bit on the forum. I did want to address, there was a question in the chat with regards to, and I'm trying to find it, from Megan, with regards to changing the minds and hearts of climate change deniers whose livelihoods are directly tied to fossil fuel industry. I will put myself in not in the camp of climate change denier. I never was one, but I did work in the fossil fuel industry, as I mentioned in the opening. And I have a lot of friends and family in Texas who still do. And I think we actually overestimate the level of denialism that exists. Our partners at the Yale Program for Climate Change Communications show that denialists are actually in the low teens as far as the US population. I would expect Canada to be similar. And so one of the things that I find personally so encouraging is I personally know many people who started their career in oil and gas like myself and are now working in renewables and working in climate action and very much are aware of the impacts. I think the thing that we have to fight against is more of the all of the above answer, which is, well, we need renewables, but we also still need more and more oil and gas. I think that narrative is the one that needs to be fought, and not necessarily that climate change doesn't exist. But I do think it's possible. I don't think it's as big a mountain as we think it is. Which takes me to a second point, which is unrelated to our extreme weather research, but we are also doing research on how to communicate to labor about the transition. And one of the things that we find is really critical on this, again, sort of always goes back to the human, is we as humans, we want to be dependable to our families, to our children, and we want to feel like we matter to the world. And so the way to sort of move people who are dependent on fossil fuels today into supporting a cleaner future is actually to help them see how they can be a part of the solution. You are an incredibly important part. You as an engineer, you as a welder, you as a construction worker are an incredibly important part of helping us make this transition happen, because the greener future actually requires significant infrastructure. The greener future is not trees and butterflies. It is actually a lot of industry that needs to transition. And so you are incredibly important to make that happen. And we find that narrative is really helpful in supporting the shift.
Awesome. Okay, we are at time. Sergio, we are going to come, we'll have you back. We also have a series of pieces of research that we'll be releasing this fall as well that touches on some of these themes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Robin, for joining us, and thank you, Chris. It's very late in Australia. Time for you to go to bed, I think, and thank you, Louise. So thank you, everyone. We have recorded this session. We will share that recording. We will also share a blog post that helps to summarize some of the key takeaways from this conversation, and also provides links to the resources that were mentioned, both from Potential Energy, but also from the work that Re.Climate is doing. There will be a survey that just was linked in the chat. We find it really helpful to have your feedback, to make sure that we're giving you what you need. And then finally, I will also say that there were a number of comments up front around the need for and how useful it would be to have more Canadian images of climate visuals, and we're working on it. So we're doing our best to have something. So watch that space. Thank you, everyone. Recording coming, resources coming. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you, everyone, for your time and for coming today.